7 of the people who were on Johnny Carson snapped live on TV. Johnny Carson was America's favorite nighttime guest for 30 years. Behind his friendly smile and laid-back personality, though, was a serious worker who wanted full control of his TV space. Most celebrities knew the unwritten rules of The Tonight Show. Be funny and interesting, but always do what Johnny says. However, some guests completely failed to read the room. They came to market themselves, movies, or albums. But these celebs crossed the invisible line that separated shocking Carson's audience into stunned silence. This could have been because they were drunk, had inflated egos, or just didn't know what they were doing. What's so bad about these meltdowns? It's not just the sight of seeing famous people crash and burn on national TV that's interesting. It's Carson's superb efforts to stay in charge, the tight smile that never quite reached his eyes, the tense look at Ed McMahon, and the desperate attempt to save pieces as they fell apart beyond repair. Many famous people have made forgettable visits on Carson's couch, but these 7 caused situations that were so awkward, so off-limits, and so against the show's carefully maintained tone that they're now legendary in the history of late-night TV. From a famous actor who upset everyone at a promotional event to a well-known comedian who took over the show without permission to the A-list pop star who quit America's most reliable host, the list goes on and on. Obviously upset. These were the guests who not only annoyed Carson, they stomped on his feelings while the rest of the country watched in shock. Let's start with the material girl herself. When she came on Carson in 1987, she traded Carson's usual sophisticated wit for something much more racy than NBC's monitors could handle. Lee, but what do you think? What am I wearing? Yes, I would buy one of those for someone if I went into a lingerie store. Please, not for me. However, for someone, they'd likely, what do I call it? That is, it's known as a booyer. A drinker. Oh, okay. Madonna is one. Too much stuff for the girl who is material. When Madonna went on The Tonight Show in 1987, she wasn't quite the worldwide star she would become, but she was well on her way. She was on the high of her Who's That Girl tour and becoming more and more known for breaking rules. Carson and his producers were hoping for a friendly but serious discussion. They got something completely different. Madonna showed up to the set wearing clothes that were vaguely reminiscent of underwear. She wore tight stockings, black lace, and a mood that made it clear she wasn't there to follow Carson's rules. As soon as she sat down on the famous couch, she went from being a guest to a provocateur. If you were at NBC that night, you may remember that the studio was dead quiet when she walked out. The Tonight Show dress wasn't like this one. It was Madonna bringing her concert image to late-night TV, and you could tell the producers were freaking out. Carson usually has a nice back and forth with guests, but Madonna took over right away. She flirted strongly with the host, said suggestive things, and purposely crossed religious and sexual lines that weren't allowed on 1980s network TV. Carson tried to use one of his trademarked subtle hints, but Madonna replied with direct comments that made Carson look like he was trying to find a way to change the subject. What they said. His well-known poker face cracked a few times when Madonna talked about her sex life, which made the censors hover over the delay button. A longtime Tonight Show writer said that Johnny laughed, but he never asked her to come back. What people at home didn't see was how Carson reacted during the commercials. He wasn't mad. Even though Johnny didn't get angry very often, it was clear that he didn't like how she took over the part and made him the one trying to calm things down. The audience's comments were split up by age group. Younger fans loved how Madonna defied the rules. Older watchers were shocked by how she purposely broke the rules of late-night behavior. There was no doubt that Madonna she made the exact provocative moment she wanted by using Carson's show as a stage and not caring about how it usually sounds. The appearance made Madonna look like she didn't care about boundaries, but it ended her friendship with Carson. She never went back to his couch, even though several albums and movies came out in the years that followed. She was one of the few big stars of the time who was quietly kicked off the show for saying too much, not too little. The smoke box of Carson. His box was broken. Then I broke Carson. 2. Not Don Rickles. The trash comedian went too far that night. Don Rickles and Johnny Carson were friends for a long time and stayed friends. Rickles was a regular guest whose appearances usually followed a pattern that people knew and loved. He would hurt Carson very badly. Carson would make everyone laugh harder, and people would love how well they got along. There was one night in 1976, though, when Rickles messed up more than just Carson's comedic flow. He actually broke a piece of TV history. The trouble started during Rickles's planned show the night before. Carson was off for a short time, so Rickles chose to sit in the host's chair. This is something that guests often do during ad breaks. The next thing that happened was strange. Rickles took the picture. Carson's desk was a smoke box that he had loved for years and had received as a gift from NBC. The next day, Rickles wasn't supposed to be there because he was shooting his sitcom CPO Sharky on a nearby NBC stage. Carson showed Rickles the broken cigarette box and made fun of him for not being careful. People who work at NBC for a long time were shocked by what happened next. Rickles walked onto the set in full Navy uniform from his sitcom without any notice or request, cutting Carson off in the middle of a segment. Television watchers saw an unplanned and unscripted Rickles hurricane for the next few minutes as he took over the show. It was funny until it wasn't, a camera operator who worked that day said again. At first, everyone was laughing at Rickles's surprise appearance, his quick wit, and his costume. But at one point, Johnny's expression changed. Rickles wasn't just insulting people as he usually does. He was actually taking over the show. He didn't just call out, he grabbed Carson's desk, yelled across the set, and started insulting people in a way that wasn't funny. Carson kept a professional attitude on air, laughing and going along with it, but backstage staff said he was really mad about Johnny crossing the line. Johnny was very upset. According to a former Tonight Show producer, Carson was protective of the show's format and professionalism, even with friends like Rickles. Coming on unannounced in costume and taking over wasn't just breaking the fourth wall, it was destroying the whole structure of how the show worked. The segment became famous because it showed Carson temporarily losing control of his own show, which wasn't something that very many people saw. The two stayed friends, but Carson was cooler toward Rickles for a few months afterward, which was a subtle but meaningful response from TV's most unflappable host. One of Carson's most trusted and frequent guests, Rickles, said it. It showed that even in the most comfortable late-night relationships, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, especially on live TV. I've never had anything to do with sex and that kind of thing. Music. Oliver, that's Don't Do This film. Well, you should see the cows. 3. Oliver Reed, the interview that became a cautionary tale. British actor Oliver Reed had already a reputation for acting off the rails and heavy drinking. Before his 1975 Tonight Show appearance, Reed had been drinking for a long time, but when he got to NBC's Burbank studios to promote the movie Royal Flash, not many people could have imagined how badly his interview would go. It was clear from the start that something was wrong when Reed walked on stage. His gait was unsteady and his eyes weren't focused. When he sat down next to Carson, the smell of alcohol was said to be so strong that crew members could smell it from several feet away. He came to promote a movie and destroyed his own career, said a Tonight Show staff member who saw the appearance. We had dealt with guests who had a few drinks before, but Reed was on a whole other level. You could see Carson immediately realize he was. Carson, ever the professional, tried to guide Reed through standard promotional questions about the movie, but Reed's answers quickly became incoherent. He slurred his words, interrupted Carson multiple times, and became more hostile when the host tried to redirect the conversation. What made the segment especially awkward was Reed's sudden changes in tone. One minute he would be charming, and the next he would be hostile. He would switch between trying to tell rambling, unrelated stories and suddenly challenging Carson with hostile questions that broke the show's normal conversational flow. Carson was very good at dealing with difficult situations, but as one longtime NBC executive put it, you could see him thinking in real time. How long could this segment go on? How could he end it without making things worse? It was like watching a chess master realize he's in a game he can't win. As the segment went on, the audience's reaction changed. At first, they laughed at Reed's strange behavior, but then they laughed nervously, and then they were silent because they couldn't help but notice that they were watching a drunk man whose behavior had gone from funny to worrying. Carson finally cut the segment short, which is unusual for him. The host was proud of never making guests look bad, no matter how bad the situation was. The event became famous in Tonight Show history, and Carson is said to have told producers, "Let's not do that again." Reed's behavior on America's most popular talk show ended his chances of becoming a U.S. star. Studios were already wary of him because of his reputation, and now there was videotaped proof of how risky it was to cast him. The segment is now both a legend in the entertainment industry and a cautionary tale meant to show that even the most controlled TV environment can go wrong when a guest starts acting inappropriately. It must have been for Truman Capote, from literary genius to late-night liability. When the author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, Truman Capote, appeared on The Tonight Show in 1980, he brought both his brilliance and his demons with him. By that time, he was already deeply involved in the substance abuse problems that would eventually lead to his death, which became painfully clear during his disastrous interview with Carson. Someone who worked for Carson at the time said, "From literary legend to late-night liability." Carson, an intellectual who genuinely admired literary figures, tried very hard to guide Capote through a coherent conversation, but the author seemed determined to derail every question. "From literary legend to late-night liability," said the writer. Johnny had a lot of respect for Capote's work and wanted to give him a chance to show how smart he was. Instead, we got a man who could barely string sentences together and was saying increasingly strange things that made everyone in the control room crazy. What made the appearance so strange? An audience member who worked that night said Carson was very patient because Capote kept talking about controversial topics and making strange, inappropriate comments about politics and sexuality that went against the show's family-friendly rules. Carson tried to steer the conversation to safer topics several times, but Capote kept coming back to the controversial topics. The audience was expecting witty literary banter from one of America's most famous authors, but instead they saw something more like performance art. Capote rambling incoherently, occasionally showing flashes of his famous wit before going off on tangents that made no sense. Carson was very patient because most guests would have found a way to end the segment early. But I think Carson kept hoping that Capote would suddenly focus and become the great conversationalist he could be. That moment never came. Carson never publicly criticized Capote afterward, but the author was never invited back to The Tonight Show, which was a telling decision from a host who usually gave troubled guests second chances. The appearance was a sad turning point in Capote's public decline, showing TV viewers how far the once sharp social observer had fallen. What made the incident especially poignant was the contrast between Capote's earlier Carson appearances, where he had wowed them with jokes and literary insights, and this last troubled interview. The contrast between Capote's brilliant writing and his rambling on-screen persona was heartbreaking. The segment is one of the most uncomfortable and interesting things to see on late-night TV. It was a glimpse into the personal struggles of a literary giant, shown live to a nation that could only watch in confused sympathy as genius turned into rambling. "This house is 300 years old, and you expect me to live in it with a baby?" my mother asked. "No one. Okay, I'll wear it next time. You need to go to the theater." 5. Shelley Winters, Hurricane in a Dress. An actor who has won an Oscar, Shelley Winters went on The Tonight Show many times during Carson's tenure, and each visit was different and unpredictable in its own way. But one visit went from being entertainingly unpredictable to actually being disruptive when Winters turned a normal celebrity panel into a screaming match that left even Carson visibly upset. Winters was already known for her explosive energy and tendency to dominate conversations. But on this famous night, she came with complaints to air and what seemed like no filter to contain them. What started as normal Carson banter quickly escalated when another guest on the couch, reportedly another well-known actress, though accounts vary on who, made a comment Winters saw as a slight. A producer for The Tonight Show said that she not only snapped, but she also shattered the segment. One minute they were having a normal, if lively, conversation, and the next minute Shelley was standing up, pointing fingers and making a scene that you just didn't see on Carson's carefully controlled show. Winters went on a rant, her voice rising to a shout as she talked about not only the other guest, but also perceived injustices in Hollywood, the treatment of aging actresses, and a number of other complaints that seemed to have been building for years. The audience, used to Carson's usually polite personality, fell into stunned silence. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was Carson's visible irritation, a rare change in his usually unflappable demeanor. Even Johnny's famously long patience started to fray when Winter yelled at him. A longtime Tonight Show staff member said Johnny could tell when he was really mad because he would start shuffling papers on his desk and look at Ed McMahon. During Shell's meltdown, he was basically making origami with his note cards. It was his version of yelling, "Help me," in public. After several failed efforts to calm things down, Carson finally used his most powerful move, calling for a commercial break. This rarely used nuclear option marked the end of a segment that had gotten out of hand. Winters was a little calmer when the show came back from the break, but things stayed tense for the rest of the show. Carson is said to have told producers behind the scenes, "Let's space out her next appearance." Winters' relationship with The Tonight Show is interesting because, despite this and other unpredictable appearances, she kept getting invited back. This shows both her star power and Carson's understanding that sometimes volcanic unpredictability made for memorable television even when it crossed comfort boundaries. Carson once said that Winters was like a force of nature you can't control. You can only aim, as a famous person once said. She was completely unafraid and careening across his carefully constructed set that night. It was uncomfortably real TV at its best. "You were talking about William Demarest. Yeah, I have a story with dirty words to tell about him. He's coming. You can't do that. I can't. But I could just say blank blank. 6. Buddy Hackett. When the funny man got serious. Comedian Buddy Hackett was one of Carson's most reliable guests. He was a storyteller whose animated characters brought the show to life. His funny stories and contagious laugh had made him a fan favorite on The Tonight Show for years. During most of his appearances, Carson would let Hackett settle in, and then the comedian would launch into long, often hilarious stories that would leave both the host and the audience in stitches. But on one memorable night in the mid-1970s, something unexpected happened. Hackett seemed to be having problems off-camera, and what started as his usual comedic storytelling took an unexpectedly dark turn. Even Johnny's poker face cracked, according to an NBC page who was in the studio that night. Hackett started off normally enough, but then he went on a rant about people in Hollywood he felt had. What Hackett said wasn't funny or angry like most of his stories. It was genuinely bitter and getting more personal. What made the segment especially awkward was that it broke the unspoken agreement between Carson and his comedian guests. Be entertaining and funny, but don't use the platform to settle personal scores. As Hackett kept naming specific producers and executives he thought were liars and backstabbers, Carson's face went from amusement to concern to visible discomfort. The audience's reaction told the story. The usual steady laughter during a Hackett appearance gave way to scattered laughter. The comedian's complaints got more pointed and personal, and Carson tried to steer the conversation back to more lighthearted or upcoming projects, according to a Tonight Show staff writer. But Hackett was determined to use his time to air grievances. It was like seeing someone use their comedy slot for therapy, raw and real, but completely at odds with the show's tone. After multiple failed attempts to bring the conversation back to safer ground, Carson had to go to commercial early, which was a rare move that showed how far Hackett had gone beyond the show's comfort zone. When they returned, Carson skillfully switched to another segment, cutting Hackett's appearance. Staff members say that Carson was more confused than angry backstage. He was worried about Hackett's health and frustrated that a guest who was usually reliable had broken the rules so dramatically. "Something's eating, buddy," Carson reportedly told his producer. "Let's check in on him before we book him again." The incident is especially important in the history of The Tonight Show because it happened with Hackett, who was not a newcomer or troubled star who was pushing the limits, but rather one of Carson's most trusted regular guests. It showed how even the strongest relationships could suddenly fall apart on live TV when personal issues crept into workspaces. After that, Hackett went back to The Tonight Show and seemed to be back to his usual funny self. But the incident showed how quickly even Carson's most carefully planned environment could change when a guest decided to break the unwritten rules. Music. 7. Red Fox. The walkout that made history. Comedian Red Fox was already a TV star, thanks to his role as the lead in Sanford and Son when he went on The Tonight Show in 1975. What should have been a normal promotional appearance turned into one of the shortest and most talked-about guest spots in the show's history when Fox abruptly left after less than 2 minutes on air. As a heavy smoker who lit up almost every day off camera, Fox thought he would be able to smoke during his Tonight Show appearance, as was common in the early days of TV. However, by 1975, NBC had stricter rules about smoking on set. A production assistant who saw what happened said it was one question, one outburst, and one unforgettable exit. Fox came out, said hello to Johnny, and then asked right away if he could smoke. When he was told no, his whole attitude changed in an instant. What viewers at home saw was amazing in its brevity and intensity. After Carson politely, when Carson told Fox that smoking wasn't allowed on set, Fox got angry and said that he couldn't do an interview without a cigarette. Carson thought Fox was joking, so he laughed lightly and tried to continue the interview. Fox, however, was dead serious. He stood up, said something like, "Then I can't do this," and walked off stage, leaving Carson alone on set with a look that was a mix of surprise, confusion, and the dawning realization that this wasn't a joke, but a real walkout on live TV. Carson called it the shortest Tonight Show appearance in history, according to a longtime NBC executive. What was so shocking wasn't just that Fox left, it was how quickly the situation went from normal to nuclear. As usual, Carson quickly recovered by making fun of Fox's quick exit before moving on to the next segment. But backstage, staff said he was truly shocked by what had happened. Carson rarely took these kinds of things personally, but Fox's sudden and public departure was a unique challenge to his authority as host. The fallout was swift. Fox's representatives quickly reached out to Carson's team to make things right, explaining that the comedian had misunderstood the smoking policy and acted without thinking. While Carson took the high road in later shows, making fun of the incident in public, they hurt their professional relationship by criticizing Fox after the fact. Fox eventually came back to the show years later, but there was always a tension in his appearances after that. It was as if both men remembered that public rift and were determined to stop it from happening again, creating a forced politeness that never quite matched Carson's easy rapport with his favorite guests. The incident lives on in Tonight Show lore as an example of how quickly carefully constructed environments can fall apart when a simple misunderstanding meets a strong personality on live TV, creating a moment of real surprise in a medium that is usually defined by predictability. There was more than bad behavior by celebrities in these 7 dramatic events. They show how tightly Johnny Carson controlled his television domain and what happened when that control was broken. For 30 years, Carson made it seem like he was having casual conversations, but he was actually carefully planning segments to show guests at their best while keeping the show's tone consistent. When guests like Madonna or Rickles questioned that, Carson's control broke. Audiences saw something unusual in Carson's world, genuine surprise. These moments stand out because they were so rare on a show that was usually known for being smooth and predictable. What's most interesting about these incidents is Carson's response to them. Unlike modern hosts who might try to make things awkward for the sake of going viral or getting more attention, Carson was from a time when professionalism was the most important thing. When faced with real problems, his first instinct was to protect the guest, even if they were acting badly, keep the show's high-class tone, and get things back to normal as soon as possible. Carson saw himself as the audience's advocate, explained a former Tonight Carson was the producer of The Tonight Show. If a guest was entertaining, he'd let them perform. If they crossed lines that made viewers uncomfortable, he'd step in, not to make things more dramatic, but to calm things down. This is the opposite of what many modern hosts might do. Carson's protective instinct extended even to guests who had legitimately messed up his show. Carson rarely banned performers permanently, no matter how bad their behavior. With a few exceptions, like Madonna, most eventually got second chances, though often with longer cooling-off periods and more careful pre-in screening. This was something that both the host and the guests knew. Be funny and real to a point, but never forget that the ultimate goal was to make consistently enjoyable television rather than shocking moments. When guests broke this rule, it led to some of the show's most memorable moments, not because Carson wanted them, but because he tried so hard to avoid them. In today's fragmented media landscape, where shocking celebrity behavior can directly translate into valuable social media currency, Carson's approach seems almost quaint. He wasn't looking for viral moments or controversial clips. He was building a TV institution that would comfort Americans before bedtime, night after night, year after year. Carson was very consistent for most of his 30 years, but there were a few times when this carefully kept front fell apart. For example, when Red Fox stormed off, Oliver Reed slurred his words, and Shelley Winters erupted in anger. These were the few times when television's most controlled environment briefly gave in to the unpredictable nature of human behavior, creating unintentional authenticity in a medium that is often defined by its fakery.